Hey people, welcome to Lecture 2 of Language and World. What I'm going to try to do in this next series of lectures is give you just an overview of all of these readings that I've asked you to talk about this weekend and into Monday. I realize that it's a lot, so I may extend that deadline because I've come to realize that maybe I'm beating on you a little bit too much. So, all right, here comes the Before we get there, I am using other books in this class. In the bookstore, you will find The Concepts as well as The Elm and the Expert by Jerry Fodor. These are both fantastic books, and I will pull some readings out of those books. So if you've bought them, you certainly can keep them. It kind of depends on your passion for philosophy of language. They're great. We will use a lot out of them, but I will scan it and I will post it to D2L. The ones that I really want you to buy are Harry Frankfurt's On Truth and On Bullshit, because I think that those are really exciting and fun, and those are going to make for a great April in this class. I'll also be drawing from these other books. So Michael Devitt and Kim Sterelny's Language and Reality, John Searle's Mind, Language, and Society, the Contemporary Philosophy of Thought and Philosophy of Language. Bill Lycan is a great philosopher. I really like him. So there are lots of introductions to philosophy of language that might help you if you're feeling lost. So especially the Lycan and the Luntley and the Devitt and Sterelny will really help you if you're feeling lost. Searle is interesting in his own right because he's so good at talking about the socially constructed world, and of course language is a huge part of that. Anyway, so I imagine that by now you've opened the book and you might have looked at the introduction to the book and it might have freaked you out. So if it did freak you out, first of all, the introduction is not assigned, but what I want you to notice if you did leaf through it, and I really mean just page through it, you don't have to read it, is that it takes language and it recasts it as a logical system. And so he really does a nice job of mapping language onto logic, with rules for meanings of words, rules for the construction of sentences, discussing how each word is going to be what it means and what it designates, how it is used, how it is placed in a sentence, and where it cannot be placed. So it's basically acting as if language and logic are the same thing. This is part of a grand tradition in philosophy of language. Basically, it was invented by logicians in order to try to get some precision in the language. We know that we misunderstand each other in all these ways, not only because we misspeak or because we don't define our terms well, but also because language can be so profoundly ambiguous. There are ways to create ambiguous sentences. For example, if I say that a child was observed by a police officer jumping from the roof, that is a fundamentally ambiguous sentence. You don't know if the child was jumping from the roof or if the police officer was jumping from the roof. We have equivocal terms like being cool can actually be physically cool, or it can also be something that is wonderful or great or culturally, hip and trendy. So there are lots of ways that language can mislead us or be ambiguous or be fuzzy, and logicians do try to come in and clean up language, and you'll notice that the people writing a lot of these articles are logicians. So don't be freaked out by all the symbols. If you do love logic, you'll recognize the similarities. And let me just highlight some of kind of the main points of the introduction. Big, broad brush strokes. Relations are an important part of language, and there's a logic of relations. So if I talk about relationships of things, so if I say that the cat is on the mat, or Adam loves Beth, or the cup is underneath the sink, I'm talking about how two things are related to one another. So sometimes relationships are symmetrical. So if A equals B, that means that B equals A. If Adam loves Beth, that's a symmetrical relationship if Beth loves Adam back. So you have one giving to the other and then the other giving back to the one in the same way in the same amount. So that's a symmetrical relationship. I use the equality sign here, but symmetry doesn't have to demand that A equals B. It simply means that whatever relation A has to B, B also has to A. Transitivity is another fun one. If A is larger than B and B is larger than C, then guess what? A is larger than C. I know you knew that. And again, larger than is not the only way to express the transitive relationship. It's just a quick and convenient example. You can also use smaller than. You can also use equal to. It's also a transitive relationship, right? So these are just ways to think about words. Again, don't sweat it. You're not going to have a quiz on this terminology. It's just convenient terminology for you to have and understand. Last one in the logic of relations that's a very big deal is reflexivity. That is the relationship where something refers to itself. And we will get into interesting and muddy questions about things that refer to themselves later on in the course. A quick example to get you thinking about reflexivity is this worry that if the explanation of how the universe was created is that God created it, of course the next question is, well, what created God? And the quick and dirty answer is, well, God created him, her, it, they, themselves. But how can something be self-creating? So it seems to be a deeper mystery or puzzle if this notion of God being self-creating, right, if that's going to work, you need to have a full-blown notion of reflexivity where something can actually refer back to itself and create itself. Again, don't stress these vocabulary words. All I'm trying to do is get you going regarding the kinds of words that we use and the ways that we think in philosophy of language. Also, several people asked me if this class was going to be a class in symbolic logic, so I want to say no. It's not a class in symbolic logic, but since we treat language as if it's a logical entity, and if you go back, right, in the beginning there was the word, and the word is logos, right, in the Greek. So logic and language really come from the same root. You don't have to rememorize all of your rules of inference and rules of equivalence, but it's a good idea to kind of bring them to mind and think about the ways that you can make inferences or the ways that sentences can be reworded and re-understood in the same way. So if I say apples and oranges, for example, in commutation, that means the same thing as oranges and apples. It's just rephrasing things in a different order, so on and so forth. So again, don't stress the symbolic logic. As we get into some of the more technical stuff like Kripke or Bertrand Russell, we may have to refresh our memories regarding logic, but do know that your logic book will be useful. This slide does not have all the rules of inference and equivalence. This is just to remind you how much fun you had in logic a couple of years ago. That's good for part one. Part two will be Frege. I'm just going to scroll through and head out to part two.